Alright, so in today's video, I'm going to be doing a valve adjustment on my KTM RC 390, just part of my off-season bike prep for the track. I'm planning on doing this every year, just every off-season, just to stay safe, even though it's supposed to be done every 10,000 miles. The bike sees a lot of red line and abuse on the track, so might as well, right? So I actually haven't done a valve adjustment on my RC 390 before, but I've done it on a few different bikes, so I think it shouldn't be too hard, especially because this bike has a single cylinder, so it should be a little easier than other bikes like my Super Tenere. That was a nightmare, by the way. I do have a factory service manual to follow, but also on Facebook, if you go to the KTM RC390 owners page, the admin has done a super helpful set of pictures and a write-up showing how to do it. So it's really helpful to follow along, especially because the factory service manual doesn't have the best pictures. It's all just black and white, small pictures, whereas the pictures on Facebook are a lot clearer as to what you actually need to do. So highly recommend checking that out if you have any questions. So the things that you'll need to do this job, other than your standard tools, are going to be some shims if you do need to adjust your valves, new spark plug because you're in there, so why not? This is the one that I'm using, on GK LKA R8A-9, and then a set of feeler gauges. You may not need to pull your cams to adjust your shims, but I think it's better to have it just so that you don't find out that you do need to adjust your valves and then now you need to go buy shims and then your bike is kind of sitting apart for that entire time that you get these. This kit was about $75, so it's not super cheap, but once you buy it once, it should be good for this bike and any other bike that uses 10 millimeter outer diameter shims. And here's the bike. So as you can see, it's already somewhat disassembled, somewhat. But to get to this part is not too hard. I have aftermarket fairings here anyway, so the way I took it off doesn't really matter for you. But in another video, I did go over how to remove stock fairings. It's about 8 bolts per side, and it's really not too hard to pull off. After you have the fairings off, you're going to want to pull the seat off, and then you have this piece here. This is the rear tank cover, kind of sits like this. The rear tank cover just has 2 bolts that go through it that attach to the tank right here, and one on the other side. And there are these 2 tabs here that go right there on in those little grommets. So one on each side. So when you go to pull off the tank cover, just kind of pry it to the side a little bit and it should pop out of these and then you can remove it. To remove the tank, you have 3 bolts, one right here, one on the other side, and then you have one bigger one right here. You can also pull off the plastic piece that comes off with it as well. And once those 3 bolts are off, I recommend getting a block like this, just a rubber block, and kind of just sticking it underneath wherever you can, just to support the tank up a little bit while you get your hands underneath to undo all the connections. That way you're not trying to pull up on the tank and put more stress than necessary on all of your fuel connections. So the connections that you have are going to be 2 fuel lines right here, and these just kind of pinch like this. You pinch the tabs and they come off. Then you have 2 breather and vent hoses right here that go to the back of the tank. And then you have this fuel pump electrical connector, as well as your fuel filter right here. And so this fuel filter just slides out of its bracket. So let me show you what it looks like underneath the tank. So this little metal piece right here is where the fuel filter fits onto. Then you have your fuel hoses that go right here and here. And then the connector itself goes right here. Not sure if you can see that. but this little oval right here. Then you also have two more. The two ventoses go right here. I would recommend getting some more blocks or rubber or something just to keep all the connections and the fuel pump, all this stuff off the ground. You don't want to be resting the entire tank on just this white plastic down here or bending any of this stuff. So getting a few more blocks of wood or rubber or whatever just to rest the tank on would be a good idea. Next up, I'm going to disconnect the negative terminal of the battery. Then I'm just going to grab a bungee cable and move all this stuff up a little bit out of the way of the valve cover. The other thing that I forgot to mention at the very beginning of the video is your bike should be completely cold when you do this. Don't even turn it on, let it sit overnight, and then go ahead and check it because you don't want your clearances to be altered by heat or anything else. So, okay, next up, we've got this plug and this module sitting right here. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these 3 bolts here. They're 10mm bolts, and just get them out of the way. Then I'm just going to unplug the ignition coil off the spark plug. Kind of set that to the side. Then I'm going to remove this hose as well. And then I can remove the 4 bolts holding the valve cover on. And next up, I'm going to take the spark plug out. Unfortunately, I don't have a 14mm spark plug socket, so I'm just going to use a regular socket and a magnet. I guess you don't really need to take the spark plug out, but it'd make it a lot easier to turn the engine over with the spark plug out, so you're not fighting the compression. Okay, it came out anyway. Okay, next on the left side of the engine, we have inspection hole thing, and this is what we're going to use to set the engine to top dead center. So I'm going to find something to pop this off. Yeah, I just used some keys. Okay, so once you've popped this little inspection hole cover out, you'll see that little point just at the base of the threads right there, and you want to rotate the engine until you see that line, and that line will tell you that you're at top dead center. Now, one way to do that is by removing this bolt and just using a nut on the crankshaft to rotate it, or as the factory service manual says, put the bike in 6th gear and then move the wheel until you can get that lined up. So this is what all the valves will look like. As you can see, the lobes on the cams are all pointing upward. And so that's how you know you can now go and check for the valve clearance underneath these lobes. When looking at your cams, you want to make sure that all of your marks are lining up as well. So you can see, this will focus, that you have all 4 marks on your 2 cams are in line with each other and kind of parallel to the valve cover mating gasket surface. So that's the way to check if you're at top dead center. All right, so before I start measuring the valves, I've gone ahead and gotten a piece of paper, drew a quadrant on it because we have 4 valves, and then wrote down the valve spec from the factory service manual. I drew the exhaust valve on top because if you look at the engine here, the exhaust cam is in front of the intake cam, so it just makes more sense to me to draw in the same orientation, and that way I can more easily keep track of my shims and measurements. So I'm going to start measuring, and I'll note down the values on this paper. Okay, so when I'm measuring the valves, I like to start with the smallest clearance that's acceptable. So that's going to just let me know right away if I need to pull my cams or not. Okay, and you can see the feeler gauge is kind of poking through. So you can see we're underneath the cam right here. It's a little tight, like you want a little bit of drag. You don't want too much drag or make it's too hard to get in. But you also don't want no resistance either. So that felt okay, but I'm going to try a 0.12mm feeler gauge as well as a 0.17. I highly doubt this is going to fit, so I'll try this one first and then try the 0.12 as well just to kind of triple check my work. So I'm going to go ahead and get that done for the other 3 valves as well, and then let you know what the measurements are. All right, and now as you can see, got to pull the cams. So these two are pretty close to the tight end of the spec, but these are way out of spec. If these two are the only issue, then I might just leave it. But since these are way out, all 4 of them are going to get adjusted now. I do like to keep these on the looser end of the range, so I'm going to try and get as close to the 0.17 millimeter gap for the exhaust and the 0.12 millimeter gap for the intake. So all 4 of them are going to end up having to be adjusted. If all these were in spec, then we'd basically be done. Just go ahead and throw the valve cover back on, put in a new spark plug, and the bike is good to go. But unfortunately, we got to go a little deeper. So in my experience as a very not professional mechanic, there's 2 ways you could pull your cams. One is just remove the cams off the timing chain, pull them out completely and set them aside on your table or something. The other way is to take a zip tie and throw it through one of the holes here and zip tie your chain on both your intake and your exhaust cams. And then when you go ahead and unbolt your cam caps up top here, you can just kind of tilt the cams to one side and grab the shims from underneath. I've done it this way for my Super Tenere just because the engine was crammed so far into the chassis and the engine's kind of tilted forward, and there was a bunch of other stuff in the way like an electrical panel and wiring and things like that, that I knew that if I pulled the cams out completely, getting them back in and timed correctly on the chain would be almost impossible just because I couldn't see at all. However, with this bike, it's all out in the open, and so I might as well just pull the cams straight out and show you how I do that. So before I actually go ahead and pull these cams out, I like to take a little bit of paint and just kind of mark the chain and the cam exactly so I know how they go back together. I know you have these marks and stuff at the bottom here that should show you where exactly the cam should be, as well as these T's and other things. But I just like to have something that references both the chain and the cam exactly together. So I'm going to go ahead and do that first before I start unbolting the cam caps and take anything out. All right, so that should at least let me know if this is going to be lined up or not. So next up, I'm going to remove cam chain tensioner to get the tension off the chain. So I'm going to remove this top nut cap thing, and then the manual says to reset the cam chain tensioner to get the tension off. So I'm going to go ahead and try that. You can see this is just like a little cover for the actual chain tensioner. There's a little flathead like slot inside of this that you need to wind all the way in clockwise to lock it. And then the manual says to remove these 2 bolts to pull the tensioner out. But unfortunately, you can't get the bolts out because it runs into the throttle body right here. So I managed to get this locked out. I think in the manual they're showing a screwdriver, but I'm using an older manual for this newer bike, so maybe things are a little bit different. What I ended up using was this Icon tiny ratcheting wrench, and I just put a flathead bit on it, put that in, and then just kept on ratcheting it down until it wouldn't ratchet anymore. And I think it's locked because now I have some movement here. You can see this chain is pretty loose. So I think I'm just going to leave the cam chain tensioner in here because this bolt that you can see at the corner here is just impossible to remove without, see, I can't even get my finger in here at the very bottom. So just going to leave that in there. I don't want to mess with the gasket. I don't want to mess with this bolt. I'm just going to hope that this is good and go on from there. Okay, so next up we have to remove the 8 bolts that hold in the cam caps. So we're going to go ahead and start removing that. These 2 are really tight to this spark plug tube, so you have to remove this spark plug tube as well, which should just pull out. If it doesn't pull out, I think you can just use a screwdriver or something. Just gonna gently pry on this. There we go. That should come out. Now you can actually access all 8 bolts. And the manual does say loosen them from the outside in. So I'm going to do these 4 first, and then the inside ones, I'll just crack them loose first and then remove them fully. They're not on there too tight anyway. Okay, all 4 of them are loosened. And before I actually remove anything, I'm just going to shove a little bit of paper towel down the spark plug hole so I don't drop a bolt or something in there. I may have to remove this again while taking this whole bridge off. But now I can go ahead and start removing the bolts and go from there. All right, here's all the bolts laid out. I think it's worth putting everything exactly in the order that they came out in. So each bolt goes right back into the same bolt hole. So you can see that some of these are also a bit longer for the ones that go through this uh, timing chain cover. So just make sure that everything is kind of oriented in the right way and everything kind of goes back where they're supposed to. So next up, I'm going to pull out the cams themselves. I do have a very long reusable zip tie here. And so I'm going to just pull the first cam out and slip this in and then pull the second cam out and then tie this around the frame. You want to make sure that you don't drop the chain down into the crankcase because that's going to end up with you having a very bad day. And I'm also kind of paranoid about the chain falling off the crank sprocket down below. I'm not sure if that would actually happen, but I'm going to try and keep some tension on the chain at all times while removing the camshafts. Okay, cams are out. I'm going to go ahead and stuff some paper towels in the spark plug hole here and then also around the chain so nothing falls in. Next up, it's time to start pulling the shims out, and so they're under these little finger thingies, so it's actually easier to pull the cams out in this case, just so you could lift these fingers up. If you could see that, let me zoom in a little. There you go. So you can see these little fingers. They actually push down on the shims, and these are your shims right in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and pull all 4 of those out and measure them. All right, so I pulled out all the shims, and this is why I think having an orientation that makes sense to you is really important because each of the shims are different. Unfortunately, these shims were not labeled, so I had to bring out my calipers and just quickly measure them. Next up, we're going to have to figure out the new shims to use from our shim kit here. So to figure out the new shims that I want, as I said, I want to leave these at the looser end of spec if possible. So I'd like this one to go from a 0.10 to a 0.17. So that's a 0.07 millimeter increase in gap or a 0.07 millimeter thinner shim. So I'd want like a 2.48 millimeter shim. These come in 0.05 millimeter increments. So I'm going to have to choose between a 2.45 or a 2.5 millimeter shim. So I'll probably just round up, go with the 2.5. That should leave me around a 0.15 millimeter gap, which is pretty much in the middle. So I'll go ahead and write that down, 0.50, and I'm just going to circle that to show that's the new one that I want. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same for the other 3. Sorry for the mess. This paper is getting oilier and oilier by the second. But as you can see, I'm basically just going down a size on each one. So yeah, I'm going to start putting the new shims from the kit in. I can also reuse this shim here because this is a 2.40 and I need to put it into that one there. So I can just kind of swap shims. So usually if you have more cylinders, more shims, a lot of times you could get away with swapping like 3 or 4 of them. So in this case, I can swap one of them. All right, and now I can just start putting in the new shims according to my calculations. Okay, so being very careful not to drop anything, I have gotten all the shims in, and then I'm just double checking to make sure that they're all seated properly. They're not kind of cockeyed in the valve, and so they all feel pretty good. This is the one that I reused, and you can see the other ones. I don't know if you can actually see that, but they all have labels on them. So these are the hot cams ones. This is the reused one. Then I'm just going to flip all these fingers down, and we can go ahead and reinstall the cams. Okay, so I'm going to put the cams back in and try to align it up to the dots that we have right here. I'm going to remove my zip tie first while trying to keep some tension on the chain. Okay, zip ties off. I got that one lined up. There you go. It looks like got both of them lined up. And yeah, so that should be it. Now you can also see, or I can see at least, the markings on the camshafts are also lined up straight. So we got that as a reference mark. We haven't turned the engine over, so we know that's top dead center. And now our dots line up. So next up, we just have to put the cam cap bridge thing back on, and then undo the tensioner, and then we can start checking things over. So back up top now, I am going to install our cam bridge. Make sure it goes back on the way it came off. There's some dowels and things I need to line up, so just make sure everything is lined up, and they'll kind of seat all the way down like this. So that's all the way in. I can start throwing in the bolts. And then the manual says to tighten these down inside to out. So I'm just going to snug them down inside to out, and then I'll torque them up to 11 Newton meters. So next up, I'm going to loosen this timing chain tensioner. So I need to unlock it. So I've got my tool with a little 1/4 inch bit on it, and I'm just going to put this in and try and loosen it. I can feel that my chain is pretty tight now. So that's how I know that has been unlocked. So next I'm going to rotate the engine by hand twice, and by hand I mean the rear wheel. And that's just to make sure that, one, the timing is okay. I'd rather find out that I messed with the timing now, when turning it over by hand probably won't damage anything if a valve does hit the piston, versus trying to crank over the engine with the starter and then things bend. The other reason is so I can recheck my valve clearances, just make sure everything is in spec and that nothing needs further adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and start turning this wheel and give it a few revolutions to make sure that the timing is all correct. The other thing to note is our paint marks are not going to line up again on the chain, just because the chain travels at a different rate than the cams do. So obviously the chain has to travel all the way down to the crankshaft and back up. So just rotating it a few times isn't going to make those paint marks line back up. Those are just for reinstallation purposes. But we just want to make sure that the other marks, the one over here in the sight window or on this inspection hole, and the marks on the camshaft themselves all line back up. So I'm just going to turn this over. The fact that it's turning over without any clanging is a good sign. Turn that over a bunch. I got to line it back up with the timing mark for top dead center. You saw it's a little bit easier to just bump the wheel a little bit each time to get this mark lined up, but that's lined up properly. And so are the cams, so pretty happy with that. Now I can just go ahead and re-measure all my valves. All right, so quick update. I checked all the valves after spinning the engine over a couple times. Timing looked fine, but the valves still were not in spec. 2 of the valves are still a little tight. So that was kind of annoying. I had to undo everything again, take the cams out, take the shims out, put the new shims back in, reassemble, and then recheck everything, retime everything. But it's all done now. You could see when I first did it, it was a 0.102. This is when I had first measured it. This is the second measurement, 0.127, still kind of lower than what I wanted. So I had to undo that and do it again and put an even thinner shim in from a 2.50 to 2.45. And now I'm at kind of the spec that I want. This one was fine. This one was also fine, but this one, again, a little bit lower than spec. The remeasurement came in at 0.076. 0.08 is the lower end of the spec, so I decided let me just redo it since I need to do these two anyway. Now that's also at 0.102, so kind of right in the middle. So pretty happy with how this is looking right now. Next step is just going to be to throw everything back in. All this has been torqued. The chain tensioner is back out, so it's tensioning the chain. I'm just going to kind of clean up the gaskets around gasket mating surface right here for the valve cover gasket. And yeah, pop the valve cover back on and start reassembling. I got the valve cover back on. Now it's time to tighten these 4 valve cover bolts. Those get tightened to 12 Newton meters. All right, so moment of truth. Got everything back together for the most part, except the bodywork. Bike is turned on, fuel pump works, so gotta go for it, I guess. This part is always scary for me because I don't really know what I'm doing. Well, that was smoky. I was expecting a little bit of smoke, to be honest, because just opening up the top end of the engine, pouring a little bit of oil. The bikes I've done in the past have always smoked a little bit, but never that much. So I actually thought that I messed something up for some reason. Even though it was running fine, idling fine, throttle response was fine, I thought something I did was wrong. So I posted on Facebook on the same very helpful owners group asking if I messed something up. But ultimately, I just decided to let it sit for a bit and then turn it back on and let it warm up fully. And honestly, now it is good. So check this out. No smoke. It starts easier, revs fine, idles fine, no more smoke. I'm happy with it. If it sounds weird, it's probably because of the mic buried in my sweatshirt. It's only really meant to pick up my voice, so I think other sounds might be muffled, but trust me, it sounds good in person. So yeah, overall, that's about it. Hopefully this was a helpful video. As you can tell, I'm not a professional. I don't do this for a living. I just kind of take things apart and hope for the best. But this bike, for its credit, is very easy to work on. Other than the tank is not easy to remove or install. But other than that, and the cam chain tensioner being kind of in a cramped spot, making it hard to access and lock out, the rest of it's super easy. The valve cover pops right off. You don't even have to remove the spark plug if you don't want to, but if you're in there, you probably should. And yeah, I would budget a weekend to do this if it's your first ever time taking apart a bike like this. If you've done other bikes before, probably get it done in about 2 to 3 hours. I did over the course of 2 days, mainly because the first day I was installing brake pads, doing the ABS delete, new brake lines, everything like that. So I started on this project a little late in the day. And also because I'm terrible at filming and at talking to the camera. So that honestly slowed me down more than anything else. When I had to redo the shims because the valve clearances weren't where I wanted them, pulling the cams, putting new shims in took less than 30 minutes, retiming everything because I wasn't filming. So definitely give yourself enough time, but I think a weekend is more than enough time for your first time. And if you've done this before, 3 hours or less. I think I could probably get it done in 2 hours next time. But yeah, there you go. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, but otherwise that'll do it for this video. Thanks again for watching. Peace.